marker float setup combining a lead, a float and a braided mainline is usually part of most carp anglers' armoury, primarily for feature finding and plumbing the depth. In the ESP range we've got 3 different markers, 2 marker darts and the original large Sonar Marker float. So while we've got 3 different marker floats, well, it's primarily for combining the float with a different size lead depending on what sort of range you're fishing at. And we found it best that depending on the size and buoyancy of the float, to couple it with a lead that's of the right weight so that the float isn't too buoyant for the lead, causing it to sort of skip across the bottom of the lake and miss key features. We make all of the floats in our own factory and they're blow moulded so that they have a very strong, tough outer section with a thick wall, and obviously they've got air inside, so they're very buoyant, more buoyant than BALSA. They're very streamlined in shape, so excellent for distance casting, and they fly straight and true and are very stable in flight due to the flight on the end of the float. Each float comes with 3 different coloured flights, the sort of all-round orange colour, fluorescent yellow and black. Orange is probably the best for most situations. Yellow is very good in low light conditions, and the black flight is very good if the sun's facing you or you've got reflected white cloud and therefore white water. It's also quite good if you want to be fairly discreet, and because the black flight is obviously a lot less visible, especially at range, to other anglers. So if you don't want to make it obvious where you're fishing, the black flight can be a bit of an edge. The setup I've got here is a fairly conventional marker float setup. I like to use a boom separating the lead and the float, and also if you've got blanket weed on the lake bed, it helps the float sort of stay above the blanket weed, making it easier for the float to come up. So basically I've got a 4-ounce lead on the end, and depending on the size of the float or if I'm changing the float I'm using, I've got a clip on the end of the lead called boom spliced on, so I can change the lead nice and quickly, and that's just sleeved with a cut down helicopter rig sleeve. Then the length of the boom I always like to have slightly longer than the length of the float so that the lead can't come into contact with the float in flight. And then at the top end of the boom I've got a size 11 Unilink swivel spliced on again so that the braid runs freely through the large ring. And I've got an 8mm buffer bead, again another cut down helicopter rig sleeve to another quick change clip that holds the float. So again with this setup I can change either the lead or the float nice and quickly. I use the ESP Marker braid, which is a fine diameter Dyneema based braid. It's nice and tightly woven, very smooth, casts well, and because it's braid it doesn't have any stretch in it, so that all the feedback from the lead goes straight into your hand and you can feel what you're pulling the lead across on the lake bed. Another feature with braid, because it's got no stretch, is perfect for distance casting. So the low diameter combined with the low stretch means you can punch the lead a very long way. So with this setup, you're obviously looking for key features on the lake bed, whether it be raised gravel areas like gravel bars or plateau, smooth silt areas, and obviously weed as well. As you feel the lead down, especially through braid, generally you get a good gauge of what the lead's landed on. So if you get a hard thud, that could be generally a hard bottom like gravel or sand. If you get a sort of softer thud, that's generally silt. If you get no sort of feedback at all, that's a good chance you've landed in weed. Once you sort of cast the lead out, you're pulling it back to see what the lake bed's like. So you get the initial feel from the lead landing, and you can pull it back. Now there's different ways of doing that. You can either pull the rod back to the side, or sometimes if you're in thick weed, you can pull it up with the rod tip held up, so you sort of like skipping the lead a little bit through the weed. If I'm sort of pinpointing an area, I like to pull the lead back through my finger. So basically point the rod directly at the lead and then just pull it back. So you're in direct contact with the lead. You're not putting a curve in the rod, which can dampen feel a little bit. And just pulling it back across the lake bed, you can feel really sort of intimately whether it's smooth silt, which feels almost like glass-like, or you can feel little donks of gravel, and then if it locks up, you know you're in weed. Another thing you can do as well to gauge the size of a spot as sort of a physical reference is, say for example, it might be a gravel feature and you're pulling the lead up onto it. You can walk backwards, again, like just literally walk backwards, pulling the rod and the lead towards you, and then you might lock up in weed on the near side of the gravel feature or the silt or whatever it is. And then that gives you, depending on the distance you've walked back, that gives you a physical reference as to how big the spot is. Once I've found a feature, I like to pop the float up on the near side of it, depending, whatever range it's at, and then bait up behind it so that the float's popped up against weed or whatever on the near side of the spot you want to fish, so that all the bait is going behind the float onto the spot where you're actually going to cast your rods. When you've clipped your actual fishing rods up onto the spot, say for example you're putting 2 rods on the same general area or the same spot behind the float, you can clip them up at the same range, but you can differ the range you're fishing onto the spot slightly depending on how you feel the lead down. So for example, if you're clipped up and you sort of follow the lead down onto the spot, you can get a little bit further. Whereas if you cast into the same range on the clip, if you pull the rod back, sort of lean back, hold it back slightly, the lead falls down and sort of wider arc back towards you. So you can have sort of two rigs fished at slightly different ranges on the same spot. So to sum up on the 3 floats in the range, there's 2 marker darts, small and medium. The small is aimed at 2 to 2.5 ounce leads. The medium, 3 to 3.5 ounce. And the big original Sonar Marker float, that's best with leads of 4 ounce plus, 4 to 5 ounce. Simply because, as I mentioned earlier, the buoyancy of the float in relation to the size of the lead, that's what's going to work best.